You know, we enjoy the opportunity to be here with you too, thinking about today about the topic of worldview and trying really to together have conversation that helps each of us to know perhaps some new ways or better ways to access cultural situations around us. Seems very, very cross-cultural here as we're driving around, noting a lot of different ethnic identities just by the way that appearances are. And you know, if I showed you a picture like this is really cross-cultural. Hopefully not too scandalous for you. This is one of the ethnic groups that we worked with, the Yanomami, and so when I see a picture like this, or when you see a picture like that, you know, I always wonder, because I've seen that picture, and so I relate to it probably differently than you do. When you see that, I just wonder what you notice. The lack of clothing probably is a striking feature there. But you know, you see some of the physical characteristics. You probably notice there are feathers, and you know, I could tell you what birds the feathers come from, and how they got, where they got them, and where in the jungle they tend to find them, and how they actually kill the birds. You probably notice that they're doing something unusual with a tube even. And you know, I could tell you that because I've been in that situation, that actually that's a hollow type of a reed that they take a long sharp object and hollow the soft reedy material out, and then they cultivate a drug from the jungle that they make a powder out of, and that these two men, based on their position that they're in, one is blowing that drug up the nose of the other. And that's a process culturally for them where they're interacting with the spirit world in their worldview. And you know, as you look in the background, you wouldn't know that this is the inside of a large, round structure that the whole community lives in together, and that's wide open in the center, and is maybe 100 meters across in the middle, and they live all together under that one common structure as protection from enemies who would attack them, and so it's like a circle up of the wagons. And so there are lots and lots of details of any cultural scene, really, and this one seems quite contrastive to what you'd be familiar with, so you would say, yeah, that's cross-cultural for me. And yet, in the world around us, anytime we have the privilege to interact with really any other human being, but particularly with people who are coming with a different cultural background or mindset, what we would think of as a worldview, that when they have a life scene in front of them, a life scene that is relating to the experience that they're bringing to bear on a situation, that they interpret that life scene in a very unique way in relationship to us. And some of even the same places where we together would be visiting with them, that they're thinking about those situations in different ways than we do. And so we want to talk about that. What does it take to begin to come to understand the mindset of the person who's an insider to a situation? What are the ways in which we can see on the surface all the physical artifacts in the body language or postures, and grow to understand the mentality, the values that are behind all of that behavior? That's where we would like to think today, and I'd like for this time as much as possible to be interactive with you. I don't know how that's going to work, but we'll find out, right? I can stand silence pretty well, so I've sat in those strange positions where there's no talking going on. It's just me and a group of people that I don't understand, and you learn to just accept the silence of it all. So we'll see how that goes today. But I would like to think then with you through some access points to what we would describe as worldview, even define that according to an author that helps us with that. And you know, it's not a concept that's unique to our day and age from a biblical perspective. I always think of the example in Acts chapter 17, where the Apostle Paul, on his second missionary journey, he models this for us. He goes to Athens, which is a cultural center that was very much open and receptive to outside philosophical ideas. They had traveled in quite a number of places by this point, and Luke, as he travels with Paul, he's describing in the book there the spirit of idolatry that they encountered. And Paul is walking in that Areopagus and identifying the various images that relate to the idolatry around him. And he says, men of Athens. So Paul's engaging with their mindset there. And he says, men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines, and one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about, he said. And so Paul immediately, as he's thinking through the way that these groups of people in that situation are thinking, he's finding ways to relate the big picture that God has presented in the Scriptures to the ways that they're encountering, engaging with life there. And he goes on to describe the way that God made every nation from one man, and they're scattered over the face of the earth. And God was the one who defined, let's say, the story that identity of mankind as it's worked out in time, that God was the one who defined that He allotted the boundaries and the places where they would all dwell. And so I trust that we together, as we think about worldview, that we relate to the core idea that God has defined the boundaries and the dwelling places of men, that He has a story to tell in the Scriptures that resonates with not only with us, but that He wants to make available to those others around us. And I think about the application of that here, even to think that God allotted the opportunity for, as Paul is described here, Paul, not the apostle, to have groups who come to live here close by, and we have access to those groups. That's part of the way that God allotted their dwelling places. And they have different points of view about life. They have different mindsets, different worldviews that are significantly different from us. And so God's given us the opportunity to engage with them, almost an Areopagus of sorts for us, that we're in a centralized place where all of these forms of worship are represented. And we have the privilege then to engage them like Paul did with the message of that unknown God that is really unknown to most, if not all of them, or certainly the majority. And so I want to talk about how to do that a little bit today. And I don't know to what extent that feels like an uncomfortable challenge for us. I don't know how many of us feel comfortable engaging with people from other ethnic backgrounds. I guess part of it depends on the insularity of the place where we've come from personally, what our family culture has looked like. But nonetheless, we all have the opportunity really to step across some of those boundaries and take uncomfortable in some ways steps, you know. And I know as missionaries, we've lived in Denton now for 2 years working with this particular local church sending agency, and most of their work has been in urban settings, not in the kinds of rural settings where I've personally grown up. And so when I just relate stories to them about, we went to South America for the first time, and we had to do survey trips. We walked a lot in the jungle, and then we had to build a house out there, and our floor was dirt. And to them, that's really astonishing. And they think, people tend to say, how could you ever do such a thing? And I could never do such a thing. That's what they tend to say. And I always think, it's just you take a step, and you take another step, and you take another step, and you follow along the steps of the process. And I think that's the same for us here too. There are some clearly definable steps in a process for us to engage with the groups of people that are around us. And the Lord can give each of us the grace and the courage to do that. And so, I think about human beings and recognize that we as human beings are people who we think about our existence. We're people who contemplate, who reflect on our existence very uniquely. And that as I've traveled around the world, these groups of people who may seem very foreign to you or even to me, as we get to know them, interact with them, we see them thinking through the facts of their existence with very similar questions and in very similar ways than we do. There's another kind of a perspective that is pretty common in our world today of this thinking being here. The naturalistic kind of perspective that doesn't distinguish well between this posture of thinking and this one, right? That would say that this guy is contemplating existence somehow too, and that eventually he'll get to this point. But we come from a worldview together that defines this kind of thoughtful process quite differently. And we are people who contemplate the meaning of our existence. One author said, we're meaning makers. We're people who, we don't live our lives just on the bare facts of our existence. That we live our lives according to the way we interpret those facts. And so, I think you may think, well, that's my life is defined that way, that I interpret the facts of my existence maybe fairly in a fairly conscious process, maybe not. But I don't know how those people over there, these other ethnicities or people with different identities, are interpreting the facts of their lives, and they probably don't care to share that with me, and I don't really care to share my interpretation of life with them. But the fact is that process of interpretation and sharing interpretation of life experience, I think we should all feel some responsibility in that. That we feel a responsibility of the story that is representing my life experience, the core experience, my core identity, is based on an interpretation of life that other people need to understand. That it's not just ethnic superiority that causes me to want to do that, because I have a belief in the significance of the story that God has given me opportunity to engage with. And so I trust that you're convinced, at least initially, that we're people who grapple with the meaning of existence and and I trust that you'll be growing in a sense of desire and conviction that we need to share that with others, and that we have the privilege and responsibility of passing that story that we have to share on to others around us. Now, as we think about people grappling with big issues of life around the world, I think we see examples of that kind of interpretive process all around us. Even here, even in art, for example. This is an interesting painting, and one of the challenges for us, I think, is to raise our own maybe awareness of the interpretive process that is present in the world around us, in the artistic world, in the literary world, even in the world of movies, that we engage with without being really consciously aware of what's being communicated sometimes. So if you look at a painting like this, what do you notice? What do you notice here? Sharks in the water, right? Yeah. What else do you notice there? Waves. So it doesn't look like a calm sea, right? Not very calm. What else do you notice? He's alone? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the mast it's broken. If the picture were more in focus, you'd notice even maybe that the mast is off, floating in the distance, or not present at all. He's surrounded by friends or foes. What we would assume would be foes, right? Yeah, interesting, right? Way up in the top corner, you can see the distant mass of another ship. This painting was painted in the 1890s by a man named Winslow Homer, and American painter. So you may not have the reference point, but the Civil War in the United States occurred in the 1860s. So 25, 30 years prior to this. And you notice the man there, he's in American terms, he's African American, so he's black. And he's not fully clothed, right? He's just got pants on. You see over in the top right-hand corner, for you guys, there's a water spout in the water there. And if the colors were a little sharper, there's a lot of tinges of red in the water as well, which would remind you of what? Blood, right? Seems like, anyway. It's a pretty small boat, too, isn't it? Doesn't seem like, at least for me personally, I haven't been on the ocean that much, maybe some of you have, but it seems kind of small for an ocean-going vessel. So what do you, as you look at those just kind of real facts, let's say, or the reality of images in that picture, what comes to your mind overall? What's your general impression here? Dangerous situation? Yeah? Very vulnerable. That's right. He's very vulnerable. Yeah, in a difficult position. What else? Anything else? A hostile world? Yeah. Yeah. You know, I've read that when, at least this is one of the stories that's told, that when the author first painted this, there was no ship up in the corner. So what would that indicate for us, just in an interpretive process of this painting? Let's say there were no masts of a ship in the distance there. It would be more hopeless, wouldn't it? And it feels pretty hopeless already, but without masts of a ship there, it would seem even more so. And so, as you think about that, as just a snapshot, an artistic snapshot of, I think that communicates a worldview. I think human beings, intrinsically, because of the way God made us, just like the Apostle Paul demonstrated there in Acts chapter 17, that human beings are hardwired to try to bring meaning to their existence. And so those who give artistic impression to our world, and these are the reasons why we hear the kinds of warnings about our media influences, let's say. Because the people who create film, generally speaking, with their artistic backgrounds, they come to that process with an intent. There's an intent there. There's an intent to communicate something. And so I see this, probably in the way that you do, as a painting that describes man alone in a very vulnerable and difficult position, right? And Stephen Crane wrote a short story, another author wrote a short story called The Open Boat, where he describes these 5 men adrift in the sea, and in the end of the story, the majority of them die, and I think maybe one reached the shore and he doesn't really understand the purpose of the process or the event in his life. And so we see kind of a naturalism, I think, portrayed here, that the tendency or the idea that man exists in a closed system, that we're vulnerable, we're adrift on an ocean. And so my overall point, though, is just I think this is one example of many in which we see people's worldviews, a worldview like this reflected in an image, a cultural image. And the people with which we are interacting come to situations in life, and the reality of their life situation has interpretive process in it, that they're interpreting life as they go through the process of living life. And so our desire is to understand the meaning frame that comes comes up in their thinking as they're interpreting life. I just wanted to mention a couple of resources, and again, this conversation that we're having, it's an introduction really to a much bigger discussion that is represented in the Access Truth resources as well. And you would be more than welcome to talk about these things, think about these things at a deeper level there. But one of the authors that has been helpful for me is a man named James Sire, who wrote a book called The Universe Next Door. And James Sire outlines the formalized categories of worldview that are present in the religious formalized identities of people around us. And then another resource as well called The Universe Next Door, in which, by Wilkins and Sanford, called Hidden Worldviews, 8 Cultural Stories That Shape Our Lives. It gives another kind of way to categorize and think about worldview. So either or both of those resources would be good for you to pick up if you are a person who reads or has more interest in this topic. There's just the pictures of the current covers. We're gonna think about. I'd like to give a definition of worldview, as we've even thought about that brief introduction that I've mentioned here, and then talk about a model or a framework that we can interact with in relationship to that, and think about some of the common questions too that relate to the worldviews that would be represented around us. Common questions that people are asking as they represent or reflect their interpretations of life in situations around us. This is a definition that I've modified to make it a little more accessible. That says that worldview is a fundamental commitment of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of assumptions that we hold about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and act and have our being. So, first of all, then, we're thinking of a worldview as a fundamental commitment of the heart of a human being, that their hearts have bought into a certain way of interpreting life. And many times those stories of life they're not formal decisions that are taken up, as you know, in your own life experience. You were born into a certain set of cultural circumstances, as I was, with a certain set of experiences around you. And so you didn't, at some point in your life, hold up all of the different views of the world and make some kind of an objective decision about which one to accept. And neither did the Yanomamo who live in the jungle or the Ata who live in the Papua New Guinea region. They didn't, at some point, hold up all of the different worldviews and say, I think I'll take that one. That the experience of their lives led them to a certain set of commitments, and that we would believe that God has a specific story in mind that He wants people to accept and to believe, and yet they've been put in a place, in a situation where they've failed to have access to that story, to that version, or that set of commitments that God would have them to access, and that therefore they've bought into ultimately a deception, that they've bought into ultimately a lie, a worldview that's not representative of the truth. And that those commitments become held at a very deep level. And that's why we describe them as commitments of the heart. And it's interesting to think of these as being able to be expressed as stories. We'll share a little more about that. And that they help to provide a framework for us that helps us to interpret reality. And then we, on the basis of that interpretation of reality, that we live and act and have our being because of that story, that underlying set of assumptions that we've each come to accept. Now, as I've said, we've seen evidence of the fact around the world, as I've traveled around the world, that these worldviews are informal in many of the world's contexts. I remember traveling, for example, I mentioned when Paul asked about relationships, I remember traveling with a man named Pepito. We traveled in the jungle a lot together in Venezuela looking for villages. And when we were doing those trips, he had heard the story of the gospel presented from creation to Christ and had heard some of the early teaching from the book of Acts and Romans. And so he was beginning to certainly have been challenged by a worldview very different from the one he believed. The Yanomamo, for example, would believe in a set of stories that would include where all of those parrots came from that they wear the feathers for. They would believe that there was a set of ancestors who existed in pre-time, and that they all went out one day to chop down a tree, and the ones who were the lazy ones, who wouldn't actually cut on the tree, were the toucans. In English we call them toucans, the ones with the really long beaks. Because they were lazy and they held back, and in their mind that logical connection works. And then the ones with the shortest beaks, the other kinds of parrots and birds who had short beaks, had worked really hard to chop down the tree. And therefore their beaks were worn down by the act of chopping down the tree. And that when the tree fell, there was an animal that was sitting in the top of the tree, and it fell on the ground, and it actually was killed. And some of the coloring from the other animals came from the fluids from that animal as he kind of splattered on the ground. And so they would have all of these kinds of stories that if you asked them to relate, they weren't always consistent from place to place. They lived in a large area of the jungle. But by and large, a consistent set of stories that they believed in that would help to explain their reality for them. And so when we came with a contrastive story of God's message, then they were having to make decisions about which of those stories was true. That there was a story that was being presented as a story, an alternative that competed with what they had accepted. And I remember working and walking with Pepito, for example, thinking about the commitments of his heart. And he had heard the stories, he had heard God's account, let's say, of the story of Joseph and Joseph's dreams with Pharaoh, and how Joseph had interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh. And then we had gotten to the book of Acts, and we had talked about the way that he had seen certain indications of dreams and visions in the Scriptures, and we had begun to lay foundations for the fact that some of those dream and vision gifts that had been represented through God's supernatural intervention with specific individuals weren't necessarily present with us today. And yet, as he's grappling through that worldview change in his own mind, I remember having a conversation with him on the trail. He went to sleep one night, and we had been away from his family and my family, as a matter of fact, for several weeks. And he was telling me how that he had had a dream that night, and that he had seen his wife. She had come and visited him, and that when she visited him, she was very angry with him because he had been away from home for so long. And so I as a believer who is in the process of helping to relay truth in that situation, felt that there was a conflict in those views of the world, right? That we as Christians would have a couple of that would be a challenging perspective for us, that we would feel that that's not biblical in a couple of ways. Number one, the first thing that always came to my mind was if she hadn't died yet, then there was no way that her soul could be separated from her body. So in God's economy, bodies and souls, living bodies are always connected to souls, and souls can't travel away from bodies. But in his worldview, there was a separation that could occur, that when a person went to sleep, that their spirit could be freed to travel away from their body. And so he was working through that process, and I remember having conversations with him about what it meant biblically for a body and soul to be connected, and how that the Scriptures wouldn't represent a perspective that could be consistent with that story that he had believed, that connected back to things that his ancestors had told him. And I could see the wrestling match that was in his heart, because he had held to a core set of assumptions about the way life worked. And they were deeply seated convictions for him. And they didn't change. They weren't easy to change. And so in the process of seeing God's narrative, His story continuing to be told, we could see what specific areas like that where that story was challenged. But I say that also to say that he was at a point of making a decision about the way that his wife's soul could or couldn't travel when she was sleeping, and chastised him for not being present. He was at a point of thinking through that decision, but it wasn't as if he could objectively just hold up the ideas and say, oh, I think I'll choose this one, or I think I'll choose that one. That over the course of his lifetime, him at that point as a man in his late 30s, that he had been brought into a system where that was taught as what was true. And so he was then in a position and working through the Scriptures where that idea had to be significantly challenged. And what does it take for us to be able to be in a place where we know people well enough to be able to talk with them about those kinds of life issues? That's a significant kind of conversation. You're not going to approach a person from another ethnic background who knows English on the street and get immediately into that kind of conversation with them. That's going to be a significant process. And we understand the ways, I trust that you would begin to understand the ways in which those beliefs are held at a significantly personal and deep level. And that getting to know people in such a way that we can see the way that their story plays itself out in real life situations, that's a significant investment in the lives of other people. I've seen that investment in my own experience. And so James Sire and these other authors, then, they give us some reference points in thinking about how worldviews develop, and also how we can engage with the stories that people have come to believe as true, and ultimately challenge those stories with an alternative. And I think that's certainly one of the strengths of the, let's say, the curriculum or the process that we're describing to you. And it's also one of our big challenges, is that we're describing relating to people in such a way that we're really coming to know the foundational stories that serve as the basis for the way that they view life. And then the challenge is that can be quite an investment in the lives of others. That we're talking about getting to know people in such a way, on such a level, that we're willing to sit and listen to them tell, in a sense, the story, the perspective of their life in such a way that we have the relationship with them to be able to challenge that at some point. And I was working with I work in that church there in Denton. I was talking with one of the guys recently, and again, my intention isn't to offend anyone for whatever methods that you've used in evangelism, but he was going to a Spanish-speaking context, another colleague in the church, and he wanted to be able to be a help to those folks. They were going to do some humanitarian aid work, was their goal. But in the process, he didn't know any Spanish. He knew a couple words, hola, and, ¿cómo estás, or whatever, how are you, and hi. But he said, hey, all I need to do is I just need to be able to learn enough Spanish in the next couple months before my trip. It's about 2.5, 3 months away. Just to be able to communicate the basic gospel message. That's really all I want to be able to do. And, for me, as a person who had invested lots of time in overseas situations learning languages, I found it challenging to be able to begin to explain to him what kind of level of communication he was actually talking about doing or being involved in, being invested in, to really get to know the lives of people and to be able to use the language in such a way that he could really communicate effectively in that situation. And in his mind, he thought, well, if I could just get a brief tract of information, I could maybe memorize it or sort of get the gist of what it's saying, then maybe I could share the gospel effectively with those folks. And so my challenge to him was, oh, you mean what you want to do then, just let me understand what you want to do, is you want to be able to share some of the most significant and challenging concepts about the core identity that they have and relate that to another alternate view of life, and to be able to communicate that effectively so that they understand the death of the Lord Jesus Christ, which comes from another cultural context, and understand the way that He was a substitute for their sin, and that they know that connected to the Old Testament sacrificial system, and that there was an atonement that was needed because God had been the creator and man had been created perfect, and then he sinned and therefore he violated God's command, and so there needed to be, and I explained a few more dots, and I said to him, is that what you're trying to accomplish? And it dawned on him. He said, yeah, that might not be a good goal for me at this particular point in time. And it's not, and the desire isn't to overcomplicate evangelism. That's not our desire, but it really is to have the right kind of expectations for engaging with people, not only in our own cultural backgrounds. I think we are challenged regularly to get to know, just to get to know the stories of people from our own cultural context, I think is enough of a challenge for us. That we don't take probably this seriously even in our own cultural context. That I want, if I'm going to be effective ultimately in building relationships such that I can influence people's lives in my own cultural setting in Denton, that's a significant qualitative investment for me as a Christian. Let alone if there are people with whom I have opportunity to relate that are going to bring when they see a scene of life, they're going to bring a whole nother set of reference points to that scene. They're going to interpret that scene of life differently. They have a whole nother story, a cultural story that helps to explain the meaning of life for them. And when they tell that cultural story, that cultural story that they're telling creates a different identity for them than the one that I would reference. And therefore, because they have a different identity, that they have a different set of convictions about what is good and what is not good. And their values and their ethic for living is much different than mine then. And therefore, the kinds of behavior that I see manifest on the surface in morals and actions, they don't mean the same thing when that group of people lives those out practically as they would when I live them out practically. And so, the big challenge, I think, if you took away anything from this conversation this time, the big challenge would be take the time to get to know the life stories of people around you, your own cultural background and the cultural backgrounds of others, that most people are very interested in talking about. Let's face it, we're all interested generally in talking about ourselves, aren't we? I mean, when you think about the times when you exchange stories, so if me and John, or if we sit down to tell cross-cultural stories, that generally I'm thinking of the story that's going to relate to the one John's telling, and that reminds me of as I've told stories, John's sitting there thinking of examples that he's had of cross-cultural situations. That and I remember the time when, and that's how life often works for us. We enjoy sharing our life experience with other people. And that by and large, I think we find that other people will enjoy sharing their life experience with us too, as we show sincere interest in them. And from that explanation of their life experience, then we can see the way that their identities are represented. We can see and hear the convictions that are expressed and how they give those accounts to us. We can see the values that play out. And we can understand the basis for the morals and actions that they show to us. Now it takes an intention that in our frenetic lives, in our settings, we may not always feel we have time for or want to take time for. But I do believe that that's the most significant starting point for us, especially in situations where there are other ethnicities represented around us. We were talking just today about the fact that one of the values or benefits for us is, and I see the same thing in the U.S. that I remember being in stores in Kimbe and P&G as an illustration of this, so myself and another Ata guy or a couple of Ata guys would be in Kimbe in the town, and the trade language is Pidgin, and so people would be speaking Pidgin, and I remember one time we were looking at cell phones. We were going to buy a cell phone, and so the Ata guys and I started talking. We started talking in Ata. Well, everybody around us, because I'm foreign, and so I wouldn't tend to be thought of as speaking the language, a local language, and everybody's instantly they're like they stop, right? They're paying attention, like, wait a minute. And the hearts of the Ata and the connection and identity is strengthened because I've taken the time to identify myself with a people group who's not representative necessarily of these others who may think they're in a superior place. And I think often that's the case in our societies where we're the ones, whether we know it or not, that have this sort of high status. And the peoples around us oftentimes feel themselves in a less prestigious position. I know in the United States, in some of the foolish comments that have recently been made by someone who calls himself a presidential candidate, which I disagree with entirely. He doesn't represent me, I'll tell you for sure. But he said some dumb things about the Latin Americans that are in the U.S. And, I know that when oftentimes I'll go to a situation, we had some guys come into our backyard the other day, and I could tell they're from Central America. And so I go out there, and they were going to do something. They were going to form up some cement that was going to be poured. And I walk out there and say, "Hola, ¿cómo están? ¿Ustedes son de dónde?" And start talking with them. And immediately the dynamic changes, because suddenly I've taken the time to identify myself with the life experience of a person who may not feel that they're in the same position that I am. That they're uncomfortable about the way that they're obliged to interact with what is the majority society, that suddenly to put myself in a place where I'm willing to listen to them on their terms and hear their stories then, and to talk about their life experience and to try to stoop to relate to their life experience, that creates an ability to identify that's unique. And I think that's often the case true. That people appreciate. I've noticed that U.S. immigration laws are a pain. My sister-in-law is Venezuelan, and when she first immigrated to the U.S., it was a huge hassle. But it sounds like Australian immigration laws are a bit of a pain too. I've noticed hearing some things about ships off the coast. They get, and I'm not going to comment on my position on that. That's not my point. But nonetheless, I would suspect that us taking the time to identify with the stories of people who are learning English or know English or are around us, and we're going to, in a sense, stoop, let's just say, not because we're inherently superior, but because there's a perception of difference there. And we're going to take the time to invest in getting to know the life experience, the story of one of those folks, like Paul said, having a couple over for supper or taking the time to ask questions in the store about the children and the family situation of that individual. I just challenge you. Take some opportunities to initiate those kinds of conversations and see what happens. Just see that I think you will notice that there will be those who appreciate that expression of interest, maybe even more than you expect, maybe even more than the grumpy older person from your old cultural background that's in the grocery store. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm just saying the possibility exists that for me in the U.S. that those initiation points of contact with other ethnicities sometimes create natural bridges that I don't expect to be so easy and so to provide that level of opportunity for engagement. And so that would be one of the probably the simplest challenges that I would issue to you is take the time really to get to know those stories of people around us. the central narrative of their lives, because their life narrative can't be told in isolation from their core beliefs. That inevitably, I've had this opportunity as we've learned language and in the language learning material that we just did tutorials for in the Access Truth curriculum, that we see inevitably that people's lives, their stories of their lives will eventually express their underlying identity. That narrative will show us how they see themselves and how they present themselves to others. And that narrative, that life story, will begin to demonstrate convictions that as you hear a person tell the account of something that's happening in their lives and you dig into deeper and deeper areas of life experience, that you'll see those convictions playing themselves out. And it gives you opportunity to understand then the ways that those convictions represent what they think are priorities in life. That you may well find there's a group of people here close by you who believe that community is more important than the individual. Whereas I would tend to be quite individualistic. There may well be a community of people who, as they tell their story and you hear their life experience manifest, that you begin to hear and understand that there's a deep-seated value of community that's different from yours. And it helps you to understand that overall view of the world that leads them to the kinds of actions that they decide to take. And then ultimately gives us the opportunity together to challenge over in the course of a relationship with a competing or at least presenting an alternative view of life.